Okay, well, good afternoon. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel on Life Course in Motion, Understanding Generation, Life Course and Family Mobilities in Place-Based Decarbonisation. I'm Nicola Spurling from Lancaster University, and I'm also a member of the Decarbonate project team, and I'm chairing the session today. I also convened the session, and I think my aim in convening the session was to bring together existing work on generational mobility cultures, life events, family mobilities and older age travel, and to bring it into debate with our conversations at this conference about place-based decarbonisation. Our panel's made up of 4 speakers. I'm really delighted that they wanted to take part and that they were able to. And our speakers are Kiron Chatterjee from the University of the West of England, Claire Holdsworth from Keele University, Russell Hitchens from University College London, and Leslie Murray from the University of Brighton. Each of the speakers has researched aspects that are synonymous with our session theme. So on topics of life course and travel behaviour, family and intimate mobilities and care, older age travel and generational mobilities. But their work does come from different research traditions, from different disciplinary backgrounds, and has developed in relation to a variety of research questions, sometimes explicitly engaging with issues of climate change and decarbonisation, but sometimes not, sometimes in relation to other debates. And this is where we would really like to invite you, the audience, to get involved using the chat function on Zoom. So we need some help to start making these potential connections between these 2 areas. We're really interested to hear your comments and your thoughts and your reflections about the synergies, the lines of inquiry, the new questions that might arise from bringing these discussions together. So on the one hand, we have this empirically grounded understandings of mobilities and family, life course, generation, and on the other hand, we have place-based decarbonisation. And so where do these things kind of come together? I suppose that in convening the panel, I did have a few hunches myself about those connections. So some of the questions that I was thinking about were things like, are life events significant for travel behaviour change? And if so, then how might practitioners in different places take advantage of those opportunities? I've also been thinking quite a lot about what assumptions of life course and family currently underpin policy. I think that during the kind of rapid policy that was made during COVID, not just in relation to transport, but in relation to a range of issues, it seemed that certain assumptions were made about the kinds of families that people belong to, and therefore how support and care could be achieved. And also ideas of family that actually shaped the kinds of challenges that were made visible, but also the things that kind of remained invisible as well. So interested to think about what assumptions do we have about life course and family, and are they really, do they really hold, and are they really useful or not? I was also thinking about how do ideas about aging kind of shape patterns of leisure travel, and where do those ideas originate? Do they need to be reshaped in some way? And are there different generational mobility cultures? And if so, what's their significance for mobility transformations? So they're just some initial thoughts that inspired the session, but I invite you to post your thoughts in the chat as well. In terms of format, each speaker is going to have 15 minutes, so there might be time for 1 or 2 questions after each speaker. And there'll also be 10 minutes at the end where we'll have a panel Q&A, which draws on the things that you've put in the chat. And then you'll go into breakout rooms where you can carry on the discussion with each other for 10 minutes, actually talking to each other in those spaces. So without any further preamble from me, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, which is Kiron. He's going to share his slides, and I'll disappear while Kiron takes the stage and come back on after his talk. Thanks, Kiron.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Is that appearing okay for everybody? Yeah,
yep.
Excellent. Yeah, delighted to take part in this panel. I've been engaged in travel behaviour research and with a life course perspective for a number of years, but I think I feel the right time to refresh my interest in this area, and I feel wary that I haven't really connected it this research has been perhaps more curiosity driven than connected into influencing some of the key challenges that we face, and the fundamental challenge we have of decarbonisation. So I think it's really pleased to have this opportunity to be involved in dialogue in this panel. So see if I can move my slides on. Yep, that's working now. So what I'm going to cover in my 15 minutes is a little bit of a rattle through life course based research applied to travel mobility behaviours, considering work that I've been involved in myself, but the wider field internationally. I hope I'm covering quite a large part of that field of work, but maybe missing certain disciplinary areas of that, but hopefully it will be a pretty broad coverage of that field, highlighting the contributions to knowledge that have perhaps been provided from looking at changing mobility behaviours themselves, looking at how changing lives and how they relate to mobility, and looking at generational differences in mobility behaviours, and then reflecting at the end on what more perhaps has life course based research got to offer, in particular for decarbonisation. A quick introduction, a very quick one really, on life course. What is life course based research? For me, it's taking what's common really amongst all the work in this area is it takes to some extent at least a life course perspective, and looks at mobility over time with a longitudinal perspective. It looks at the relationship between the life of individuals and the historic and social economic context in which they have lived. And there is a quote which I think nicely encapsulates what the life course perspective is about, from Janet Gieler and Glenn Elder, who are the pioneers in the area of life course research. And they highlight that it's about viewing the lifespan dynamically, looking at how one point in time is not only influenced by that moment in time, but what's gone on before and people's future aspirations. And it notes the integration of individual motive with external constraint, which is a tension that is critical when we think about mobility behaviours and decarbonisation. I should say it's a multidisciplinary paradigm. It's no unified theory. It brings in perspectives, theoretical ideas from many different disciplines, and can be, I suppose, challenged in being a bit atheoretical really from that point of view. It brings in its own language in a way, terms such as trajectories, which refer to over people's lives, what is their pattern of behaviour or experiences in different domains. It looks at transitions, points of influence to those trajectories. It looks at turning points, where major changes in the direction of people's lives in a particular domain or more generally. So I'll probably refer to a few of those terms as I go through. Just connecting it to mobility behaviours for a moment, it really helps reveal, practically, it helps reveal stability and change and understandings around those. And it connects quite closely to ideas of habit, the idea that travel behaviour becomes automatic in a stable context, as psychologists put forward. And the fact that behaviours may be reconsidered when contextual discontinuities occur. And the range of contextual discontinuities that we may consider are quite broad, as I'll touch upon. but do include micro events, things that happen in the lives of individuals, but also macro events in the wider environment. So I think the life course perspective is very suited to looking at this stability and change. So I'm now going to do rattle through the contributions to knowledge that I see that have happened out there through looking at some different themes, and I've categorized these under 3 themes, and the first of which is about research which has directly looked at changing mobility behaviours. Generally, it's just looked at a moment in a short-term period of time and how mobility behaviours may have changed during that period of time, and try to explain those. I'm going to draw particularly on research I've been involved in to kick that off, and highlight, just give you a flavour of some of the findings that have been produced. So research that I've been involved in for the Department of Transport was looking at young people and how young people are driving less than young people used to do. And as part of that, we looked at driving licence acquisitions and used Understanding Society panel data, which gets data every year from a large group of participants. And we focused in on younger participants to Understanding Society to look at those young people and whether they're requiring licenses or not, and what might be explaining young people that were from one year to the next acquiring a full driving license. And our statistical analysis that we conducted found that socioeconomic influences were the most important ones, particularly around employment status of young people. And those bars, I don't expect you to be able to grapple with all those bars in the bar charts on the right, but if you look at the longest bars, they are indicating that being in employment or moving into employment from being a student or not in employment or a student or in education was the most had the largest effect on the likelihood of gaining a driving license. But notably, it wasn't only about that, just that kind of binary employment status, yes or no. It was also about the family background, family economic circumstances. So having a father in work when aged 14, rather than the father not being in work, also showed up as a significant variable. So it's just also about that history, socioeconomic history, playing a role. And also relevant, which is also, I guess, related to that economic circumstance and wealth, was if a young person is in a household with more cars available, presumably before they get a license being used by other members of the household, but that the number of cars available may appear to prompt young people being more likely to be able to get a license. Having a car they can perhaps learn to drive in, but so it's perhaps quite a practical inevitability, if you like, but it's a very, very strong effect, and shows how that advantage of having cars in the household has a strong influence there. I've looked at in previous research, looked at car ownership across the household rather than for the individual, and the circumstances in which households change the number of cars they own from all different levels. And this is important because around 1 in 5 households do change car ownership from one year to the next. It's quite a high proportion. And we found this mainly changes that occurred, mainly driven by family composition situation and employment events. But it was also important to note that public transport accessibility mattered. Those households that had poor public transport accessibility, well, all else things equal, more likelihood to change up the number of cars they have in their household. And we had the opposite effect. Those with good public accessibility were more likely to change down. So that structural factor came out as important, as well as the household factors. And moving away from the kind of mobility assets or tools to the behaviour itself, mobility behaviour itself, research we've done looking at commuting has looked at the likelihood of people moving to and from car commuting, and found that it's the most important driving factor is home job moves to induce a change in commute mode, and they do that through modifying the distance to work and the travel options but not just that distance, but also the travel options available related to those home job moves, and the built environment characteristics related to where people move to. May be quite expected, but it's useful to confirm that finding. But also, perhaps not so inevitable, we found car commuters were more likely to switch to non-car commuting if they were willing to act, if they had a pro-environmental value, being willing to act to protect the environment. So people use the opportunity of these life changes perhaps to more closely align their behaviour to their values and attitudes, which suggests these life change moments being opportunities for people. I should mention other people have done research on other mobility behaviours, just mention that briefly. And the first one of these is really, I think, crucial for decarbonisation. But it's only the one study that I know about that's really looked at annual household car kilometres, which gives a more strongly directly connected indication of carbon intensity of people's mobility behaviour. And as I say later, that would be great if more research could do that. And the third of these looks at the combination of modes people use, which I think is also really important, people's capacity to use different modes. I think it's very instructive for decarbonisation. Finally, on mobility behaviour change, some research now more on from the qualitative and more qualitative oriented research has looked at turning points in people's mobility, and has, by discussing people's mobility with them directly, has allowed people to indicate how important, when and why important changes to their mobility have occurred. And research there is, for example, focused on cycling. Australian research looking at returns to cycling among women through in-depth interviews showed the importance of social relationships in inducing those returns for young women in their 20s, and for women in their 30s, health and fitness was a key motivating factor. And I've also been in research which has more broadly looked at changes in cycling towns, and found that life events and life circumstances are really important, but also the improving cycling environment in those towns where it happened did also play an important facilitating role alongside life change opportunities. I move on to look at now research which has come up the other end of it, looked at this from the other end of the relationship, looking at rather than mobility behaviours, but started on with the perspectives of changing lives and the particular events that occur in people's lives. And I think there's plenty more scope here, but research has tended to focus particularly on residential relocation, but there's also been interesting research on other life events. So in particular, new parents, the PhD thesis by Laura McCarthy in Melbourne, looked at parents and found that they tended to adopt car-oriented travel behaviour following parenthood, but it wasn't the case that was always the case. There were some the new parents that went the opposite direction and used public transit, for example, more, and looked at the factors causing those different changes after starting parenting. And research on students moving from education into the working lives in Germany showed a general move, again here, towards car commuting, but this was lessened where young people had rail-based public transport opportunities. And in that research, they emphasised the importance of employees offering public transport passes to new workers to encourage them to develop public transport patterns of use early on in their careers. More generally, rather than just focusing on one particular life event, some research, small amount really, has looked at socialisation and investigated the role of parents, spouses, schools, neighbours, a general age cohort, or collective urban mobility cultures. And I just highlight a couple here. Lisa During and colleagues in Germany looked at intergenerational influences from parents and grandparents on young people, and found influences on residential choice and travel attitudes in particular. So that intergenerational influence is apparent. They didn't find it so much directly affected transport mode use, but found it worked through those residential choices and the broader attitudes. And Michael Smart and Nicholas Klein have looked at exposure to transit during young adulthood, and found that those who are more exposed to transit in the United States are associated with a lighter car lifestyle later on in life and greater public transport use. I should mention research not so much on events that occur within individuals' lives, but more broadly, more generally, disruptions, and there's been a really important research done here, I think, involving Nicola, our chair herself, and Greg Marsden, organising this whole conference, and others. And that's looked at natural events, other disruptions to the transport network, and found there's more adaptive capacity amongst the population than has perhaps been assumed. And that indicates there's greater scope for changes to mobility behaviours than is routinely considered. And the COVID-19 pandemic might also, build on that. And one piece of research that I've particularly interesting that I've seen, and has from Australia, has shown looked at the long-term impact of the pandemic on the mobility of young adults. And it's very early to say what those long-term impacts will be. There have clearly been very big short-term impacts, which they highlighted, but they note that there have been that the effects are likely to be indirect through affecting young people's life plans, which have been in some cases accelerated, in some cases delayed, and that's going to have knock-on effects on longer-term mobility. But I think there are also questions about whether it might more generally affect habits around mobility and aspirations around mobility as a result of the pandemic and experience of the pandemic, combined with the climate crisis. Finally, I just want to look at contributions to knowledge briefly around generational differences. The research that I've been led on for the Department for Transport on young people and their reduced car use, well, it's shown that the changes that have occurred between successive cohorts or generations, and this shows particularly for men how the latest cohorts shown in the bottom of the chart, those born in the 1990 to 1994, exhibiting much lower car use, and their car trajectories are starting at a lower level and not catching up. At least at that time, they weren't catching up with previous generations in terms of their car use. So there's a lot of interest in that, and whether that might suggest a sustained change in the future. There's a lot of quantitative studies currently carried out, seeking to look at survey data and distinguish age, period, and cohort effects to really examine whether these effects that we're seeing are temporary through period effects, recent circumstances, or they're longer lasting cohort effects, which might affect a generation for longer period. Or they're even age effects, where it's just a temporary delay in young people before they move on to greater car mobility as they go through milestones in their lives, which have perhaps been delayed. So researcher, for example, has suggested that there are a big contribution to that reduction in car use is explained by a generational cohort effect. In particular, the US research suggests it's a millennial specific effect. It could be related to changing attitudes and use of virtual access opportunities. And research that I was involved with a colleague, Heather Jones, I think it's a small piece of research, but I think it shows importance of now looking at doing more qualitative research, trying to get unravel what's happening. What are these generational effects, which can't really be explained through survey panel data and through interviewing interviewing people, talking to them about their behaviour. Can shed a lot more light. So, for example, we found, compared to the boomer generation, more recent generations of women have tended to learn to drive a lot earlier and organise their lives around the car, which might explain, in the case of women, a greater or an earlier attachment to the car than was the case in the past. But in contrast to men, younger men compared to the boomer generation men are exhibiting longer periods in early adulthood without daily use of the car, not in all cases, but in some cases, and that may be playing an important role. So just to finish then, what more has life course-based research to offer? Well, I'll answer that by just summarising contributions so far. I think the research demonstrated the importance of structural factors as well as personal factors on mobility behaviours over the life course I do want to emphasise, yeah, that life course based research isn't just about individuals and their families. It does. I think it is equally effective at looking, or it is powerful also at looking at structural factors. So that might be a criticism that could be put to it, but I'm not sure that's fully justified. It could be debated. It is highlighted that mobility can affect lifestyle plans and decisions. So it's a bi-directional relationship between mobility and lifestyles and lives. Mobility is not just an outcome of people's lives and lifestyle choices. There's practical value, although I'm not sure it's been fully delivered, in better understanding people's life contexts and when might be a good time to promote alternatives to them, to inspire them to have lower carbon mobility. And one example is work we've done in the west of England, but it's happened elsewhere. I know new residents travel packs, so engaging with people as they move home to encourage them to embed lower carbon mobility and other environmental behaviours after moving home. That's certainly is being applied in the field. The research also shows the dead hand of the past, which perhaps can be looked at negatively, but more positively, if we can create capacity for change early on in people's lives in childhood and younger years, that can perhaps instill greater prospects for decarbonisation as people get older. And future opportunities, I want to highlight longitudinal data sets haven't really been able to track carbon intensity of mobility behaviours over time. And it would be really helpful if we could include more information, gather more information on that in longitudinal data sets, to then be able to allow those changes, stability and change in carbon intensity to be explored, explained, perhaps even related to interventions that we test out. And I think there's a real value, something I haven't mentioned and only mentioned now, is to focus on not just typical individuals when we do qualitative research, but outliers, potential trend setters, and just some examples of the past, but I'm sure you can think of many other examples. My research has looked at car club members, which I don't know whether you would consider them trendsetters. I've looked at older cyclists, a fairly rare breed. We've looked at older cyclists and what allows some older people to continue to cycle or even start cycling in older age. And really interesting research from Sattleger and Rao in Vienna looked at those people that are voluntary in their, not carelessness, but their carlessness, and spoken to those people about why they choose to do that and what lessons can be drawn from that. So I'll finish on that note and pass back.
Thanks for that, Kiron. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. Really great start to the session, actually, and a really interesting and quite extensive overview of the kind of field of life course and mobility. I'm actually going to invite Claire to share her slides. We'll go straight on to Claire's talk now and come to kind of questions and discussion at the end. Thanks, Kiron.
Thank you very much. And Nicola, if you want to just give me, if you want to say when I've been going for 10 minutes, that might be quite useful. I think that works quite well in Zoom, to be honest. I don't mind the interruption. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's a Friday afternoon, so I decided to do a slightly different talk. I'm not going to be presenting research per se, I'm just going to be presenting some few ideas. And the title of my talk is What About Care? And I'm going to be asking the question, what about care, and why this needs to be central in developing practices and infrastructure for decarbonising the everyday. Before I start, my slides are not moving on for some reason. There we are, they are now. I'm going to have to plug this because it was published last week. I've spent the last 3 years funded by the Leverhulme Trust to do a project on the social life of busyness, and my book was published last week. It's still unfortunately quite expensive as a hardback, but at least you can enjoy the cover. If anyone's going to judge a book on its cover, I really hope that you're going to judge this book on its cover, because the publishers did an amazing job. Anyway, you will find a few of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon in this book. But moving back on to what I'm going to be talking about, specifically about care this afternoon. So my starting observation is that care is not often central to questions about decarbonisation, particularly when it comes to mobility. When we talk about and research mobility, we tend to focus on those and those activities that are associated with the economy rather than with acts of non-production. So there has been an improvement in recent years. Education and health mobilities are recognised along with commuting, and what I've read about the 15-minute neighbourhood, this does recognise that services within walking distance include healthcare and education, along with work, shopping and leisure. But the bias remains towards acts of production rather than those orientated towards non-production. This is not surprising. Feminist researchers that have been arguing for many years to put care at the centre of social science inquiry and policy. From Joan Toronto's observations that caring for ourselves, others and the environment is central to human existence, Judith Butler's observations about theorisations about how self-identities are realised through interconnectivities and interdependencies, through to Lisa Baritza's recent account of enduring time and how this relates to care. Lisa's observation about the significance of non-events illustrates how acts of non-production sustain and enable those of production. Incorporating care into planning is notoriously difficult. Indeed, care is often described as a wicked problem. It's too incomplete, contradictory and challenging to fit the more rational requirements of planning. However, it is not satisfactory to assume that it is not possible to integrate care into mobility design. At the same time, if we are looking into how to decarbonise everyday life, we clearly do need to take care seriously. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I don't think it is reasonable to dismiss care as being a wicked problem. Yes, it certainly complicates how we decarbonise space and mobilities, but we need to recognise the challenges that care presents. So rather than focusing on integrating care into decarbonisation, in the 10 minutes that I have this afternoon, I want to suggest a different focus, that thinking about care foregrounds certain practices and principles that need to be central to decarbonisation. So as it's a Friday afternoon, I'm going to take a slightly different approach, and I'm going to do this with a case study of my own attempts to decarbonise care. So I realised that a self-study such as this might not meet the requirements for rigorous social science research, but autoethnography, which I've been doing quite a lot of recently, is a valid method. And in this paper, I'm going to use it to raise issues that are associated with care and mobilities. So my mother lives 6.5 miles away from where I live. It's 15 minutes by car and 35 minutes by bike. So we don't live in the same neighbourhood. I live in a small town and she lives in a village. But for a caring relationship, it's quite a short distance. My mum is healthy, but she lives on her own after my father died last year. I talk to my mum or visit her almost every day, and I'm her main support for health appointments, some shopping, general advice about looking after her house, DIY, technology issues, etc. So I'm not quite providing elderly care at the moment, how that might be formally conceived of. I'm more in a looking out for role, though we both expect her needs to change in the years to come. So I've attempted to decarbonise my care as much as possible, and I cycle to my mum's house. So I'm now the owner of 2, not 1, electric bikes. I've become a bit obsessed about these. And I've also invested, as you can see here, in decent wet weather gear. So neither terrain nor weather stop me using my bike, though I must admit I do draw the line at ice and snow, or particularly wet, dark winter nights. However, despite my attempts to decarbonise my care, I only cycle about half of the journeys to my mum's house. And these are the reasons that I've noted over the last 6 months for why I don't use my bike. So these include taking my mum to hospital appointments, emergencies. This is probably one of the main reasons that I need to get in the car. These can be health emergencies, but often it's something that's gone wrong in the house, something that's upset her. She had a fall earlier this week. It's those kinds of unpredictable events when I tend to use my car. Looking after my mum when she is ill, when I have to make regular and frequent visits. Visiting with other people, even though I own 2 bikes, I can't convince anyone else to cycle to my mum's house. Delivering shopping, particularly things like heavy bags of compost, which she herself finds difficult to get for herself. If I'm calling in my way on to somewhere else, or finally leisure activities when me and my mum are going to be going out for the day. So my observation about the challenges of decarbonising care is not simply that we need to think about solutions to these specific challenges. I mean, in my paper, I'm not going to go through sort of what are the solutions to these practices that I've identified here. What I'm suggesting is that thinking about care helps us see everyday practice in mobilities in a different way. And it is these qualities that we need to integrate into planning for decarbonisation. So I'm arguing that thinking about care highlights 3 dimensions of the everyday: temporality, relationality, and materiality. So I'm just going to quite briefly talk about each of these things, and I'm going to have more to say about temporality and relationality than materiality, because that's something I've only really started thinking about. So first of all, with temporality. So there's a tendency in theorising accounts of social change to polarise interpretations of time between different tempos. For example, in equating global capitalism with social acceleration and the overall speeding up of society. Counter-narratives tend towards a description of slowing down. Hence, decarbonisation is often linked with the slow movement and the assumption that speed is environmentally damaging while slow is more nurturing. Rather than assuming that we have to move between being either slow, or fast, empirical researchers on temporality, and here I'm really thinking of writers such as Sarah Sharman and Judy Weissman, interrogate how temporality is not unidirectional. In these empirical studies of the uneven politics of time, we are not all either universally accelerating or slowing down. Sharma in particular develops her theorization of time through the concept of power chronography. She offers power chronography as a development of Doreen Massey's formulation of power geometry. Sharma contends that while Massey's foundational writings about space as multiple and relational have inspired the intellectual project of the spatial turn, the temporal imaginary has received less attention. She argues that it is not enough to acknowledge the multiplicity of social time, because an understanding of temporality needs to make the differential relations of power within time very visible. So Sharma's examination of the uneven politics of time effectively demonstrates how the temporal is not a generalized experience, but a form of social power and a type of social difference. Privileged workers have greater dominion over time and more opportunities for diverse temporal expressions, for example, acceleration at work versus slow leisure. So recognizing the empirical validity of the uneven politics of time also means that it is not possible to apply a particular tempo to care. And I must admit, this is a limitation that I find with Elisa Baritza's recent writings about enduring time. Her interpretation that the tempo of care is experienced through waiting, staying, delaying, enduring, and returning against a more vitalist interpretation of time can, I think, sometimes be seen as glossing over the urgency of care. The temporal...
You've held your 10 minutes, Claire.
Thank you. The temporal, that is brilliant. The temporal challenges that I have about looking after my mother, and I should also say the same was true when I was looking after my daughter when she was younger. It's not just about the time that you commit to care, it's when the unexpected happens. When you get the telephone call that your child or mother is ill, when you have to make changes at the last minute, when you suddenly have to be in another place. This is the problem of the normative reading of speed equals bad and slow equals good. There are times when the necessity of speed is a social benefit. So the idea that universally taking longer to make journeys is beneficial does not always hold. So thinking about the temporality of care highlights the diversity of tempos and ways of spending time in everyday practices. So moving on to relationality. As other scholars who are contributing to this session have argued, relationality needs to be central to interpretations of mobility. Moving on from what David Bissell described a few years ago as the focus on pointillist mobility. That is, we're not simply moving between discrete points. Again, there can be a tendency in writings about future urban spaces might look like to focus on individual movements, the commute to work, individual visits to a health centre, while taking children to school is relational. It's also one of those relational mobilities that is very contained within a household unit. It doesn't really get to that kind of more kind of wider relational mobilities that I think we experience in a lot of caring relationships. So care does not fit into pointillist individual behaviour. Care is, of course, inherently relational. It's almost a tautology to talk about care and relationality. But the kinds of relationships that are sustained and sometimes broken through care are often contradictory, and they are very rarely balanced. So care is about being co-present in space and time. And while clearly advances in digital care have been made recently, especially during the pandemic, I think we are all very aware of the limitations of these forms of online interactions. So the challenge of care is not simply a case of bringing different people together, but recognizing that people in care relationships are not always equal in how they move about in time and space. Thus, the challenge that thinking about care makes for decarbonising mobility is to think about the unevenness of relational mobilities. Going back to my case study, it is enough to plan. I can plan my own access to healthcare, but a lot of my mobilities is about getting my mum to her appointments or about visiting people who are receiving care. So the third dimension, which I hinted at the beginning, I probably have less to say, but I think it's really kind of made me think about when I was putting this presentation together, is about materiality. So it's occurred to me that a lot of what I do about caring for my mother it takes a very material form, whether it's picking up bags of compost or doing DIY jobs in the house. The assemblage of care is not just human, but it includes an assemblage of more than human parts. So decarbonisation has to consider the movement of material as well as material and materiality as well as people, and recognise that this movement is a crucial component of care and intimacy. Shopping for other people is one of the main caring activities in an ageing society. And we cannot overlook the intricate and intimate mobilities that take place around these everyday activities. The materiality of care cannot be dismissed. It is as important as emotional and physical care. So the challenge for decarbonisation is not to separate the mobility of people from the mobility of goods. Moreover, to recognise that provisioning is not just within households, it is also carried out between households. So I hope that gives you an overview about why I'm using care to think about when we're thinking about maybe visioning what decarbonising the everyday can look like. That when we start to think about care, we can think about these principles of temporality, relationality, materiality, and how these are involved. So just like to say thank you. If you want to find anything more about what I'm doing at the moment, then I do a lot on Instagram. I've got an exhibition coming up as well. I probably should plug that. It's called Threading Time, and that's in November, December this year. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claire. Fantastic to hear about your new work and your thoughts about care. It really struck me actually that, I guess, in contrast to some of the other discussions we've had at the conference, about the individual sometimes be the focus, the kind of solo traveling mobile individual as being the focus of mobility innovations, and it struck me that a focus on care really decenters the individual, because you are instantly thinking of relationality and of multiple kinds of movement. So yeah, really appreciate it. We're going to move straight on to Russ now, but come back at the end for some further discussion. So Russell, you're on next. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicola, and thanks for the opportunity to take part So I'm going to talk about a project that I did a few years back now, I don't know, maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, that speaks directly, I think, to some of these themes. I haven't thought about it for a while, but I think there's definitely things that were part of our project that relate quite closely to some of the things we're trying to talk about and understand here today. So hopefully it'll be useful to the discussion. I need to make it into the slideshow. Okay, can you all see that line? Taking that as a yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a project I did as part of the broader work of the Demand Centre. Many of you will be familiar with the work of the Demand Centre that was organised out of Lancaster, a big project that was aiming to think in an innovative new way about the creation of energy demand by starting with the ways in which people live and what they're doing and what that might mean for the extent to which they might live in more or less resource consuming ways. So as part of the work of that group, that centre, I worked together with a bunch of people on a specific project. So this was done together with Rosie Day at Birmingham and also 3 different postdocs. So Sue Venn was part of it, also Emmett Fox and also Julia Hibbert. And we were looking at later life leisure travel. In the talk today, I'm going to focus on some of the aspects from the study that I think were most interesting and perhaps most relevant to what we're doing here, which is to focus on this idea of circulating expectations. So where do our ideas about what older people should be doing with their leisure travel come from? How do they move around, and how are they perhaps potentially responded to by older people themselves? And what does that tell us about opportunities for potentially encouraging less resource intensive ways of organising leisure travel? So I'll tell you a bit about those aspects of the study, and then I'll try and, if there's time, link that back to, I guess, some of the things that came out of the STAR study that connect to issues to do with life course and local decarbonisation. We wouldn't particularly focus on the locality, but I think you can extract lessons from our study that would connect to a focus on that kind of thing too. So this is an overall slide that depicts all of the different things in a nutshell that happened as part of the work of the Demand Centre. The 2 aspects I want to particularly highlight that I think our project took forward was firstly a focus on how and why end use practices change over time. So how can we look in detail at what's happening in terms of particular ways of moving around for leisure? In this case, how do they change? And what can we learn from an in-depth appreciation of how and why they change? And as part of that, we were interested in how certain systems, so ways in which societies organise themselves, reproduce certain ideas of need and entitlement that might then be drawn upon in shaping the ways in which we understand the dynamics of certain practices. So the changing ways in which, in this case, older people might do their leisure travel. How is that connected to broader socially shared ideas about need and entitlement and about what's acceptable and normal to do in terms of your leisure travel in this case? So they're the 2 ideas perhaps that I think we drew upon most heavily in our particular study. Our objectives in our study were to firstly to understand how leisure travel needs, so drawing on that idea of needs specifically amongst a particular group, so older people in the UK specifically, how those needs are made and met. So the wider context within which particular needs are defined and how societies at large respond to what we think older people might need in terms of their leisure travel, what they should be doing. And to consider how this process could be influenced in pursuit of less energy demand. So in a similar way to the work of Decarbonate, we were motivated by a sustainability objective, by an intention that was largely about trying to reduce and steer, influence, shape, feature patterns of life that could be potentially less resource consumptive, whilst also fulfilling people's needs. So why did we zoom in on older people and what they were doing with their leisure travel? Well, there's various reasons why you might think of older people's leisure travel as potentially a hotspot of energy intensive social change. So an area of life in which things might be moving fast and moving in an energy consumptive direction. So there are more older people around in aging societies, so logically that might imply that more energy will be consumed. because they're more people in a general sense. Then we've got the retirement of a comparatively rich generation. So how it is that people are comparatively well off compared to other generations feel they should use their money. So what should they be doing with that wealth when they move into retirement? Well, one obvious thought might be to do plenty of travel to reach the fulfillment that might come from that. And maybe there are also new ideas about later life fulfillment that are abroad in society. I suppose specifically we're connecting to notions of how the baby boomers as a specific generation might think about what their lives are, what fulfillment is for them, and how that might lead them to potentially feel that they should be traveling around more than older people might have done in the past. So some interesting tensions there to do with aging and also about generation. So that's the background context to why we focused in on this group. In terms of the different things that we did as part of the project, so one of the things that we did that I think might be relevant to some of these discussions is to look at the ways in which travel was more generally being thought about, conceptualized, if you like, by different bodies of wider literature that might have some bearing on how we as societies at large think about what older people should be doing today, and in ways that might then bleed into how, as societies at large, we also think about how leisure travel might be understood as potentially a positive thing. So in this sense, I guess we're interested in circulating expectations in terms of wider society and also in the academic literature. So we looked across different bodies of work and we tried to characterize and think about the ways in which different bodies of work define and think about the relationship between older people and travel that might have implications for how we think about leisure travel and the fact that older people might be traveling further distances, doing more travel than they might have done in the past. So we evaluated the way in which active aging agendas were potentially shaping the way in which we thought about travel more generally for older cohorts, so not traditionally focused on distance travel in the way that our project was, but definitely some evidence of those kinds of ideas potentially bleeding into a more widespread assumption that it might be a good idea for older people to be traveling. Well, at what distances should they be traveling? At what points do active aging agendas no longer apply? It's often thought to relate to increasing social contact and other aspects to do with the locality, but maybe some of these ideas could be feeding into the ways in which we think about travel further afield. Then there was ideas related to the baby boomer generation I've mentioned already, a broad assumption that potentially older people from this particular generation have particular ideas, aspirations, notions that might be leading to them traveling further afield than generations before them. So an assumption there about the boomers being on the move. Then if you look at mobility research more generally, I mean, you guys will know much more about this than I do, so I'm a little bit nervous about this part. But one of the ideas that we developed in that paper was the assumption that, well, generally speaking, if we look at how mobility is thought about with regards to older people, the idea is that it's generally a good idea. So it's good in terms of social contact, it's good in terms of keeping physically active. There are lots of reasons why those people that might want to think about life course issues, I suppose, in terms of how we might harness processes of change over time in that kind of way, how we might work with that in pursuit of less energy intensive societies might come up against all sorts of wider discourses and established areas of work that might be quite reticent about buying into those kinds of ideas, because there are lots of reasons why in this case moving around could be really good. It's providing lots of valuable social functions, doing lots of positive things for older people. And then finally, we turned to literature in tourism and tourist promotion and marketing, where the notion there was, well, generally speaking, their work was to help businesses make the most of this expanding sector, so finding ways of encouraging older people perhaps to travel more, to travel further away by catering to their needs. So when we looked across the wider literature, we found that lots of different ideas out there, but more generally speaking, they weren't as much inclined as we might have been, given the agenda of the demand centre, to think critically about energy demand issues and how that might connect to the ways in which we're looking at what older people are doing in terms of their travel and thinking about that. So maybe the wider literature, as much as anything else, was acting to push people around, to potentially encourage older people to travel more than they might necessarily want, and which might also be potentially quite energy consumptive. Then we looked at the various different broader data sets that could be of relevance to us. So we tried to situate our project within broader issues and understandings of trends that can be discerned. Certainly it would seem that older people at the time were not flying more than ever before. So in terms of This is a graph depicting over time the amount that different age groups are likely to fly. It seems they're not flying more than ever before, but they were going further afield. So this is another source of evidence. So looking at people travel, you can see that people of a particular age group, aged over 65, are increasingly going further afield than they might have done before. So we try to then situate these broader trends and to think about how they might be manifest in their lives, the ways of thinking about their lives, the ways of talking about their lives, both to themselves and to others and to us, that might help us to understand how these processes were kicking in for these groups. So we thought what might help us understand these trends? Well, maybe a focus on the evolving norms that underpin existing and aspirational leisure travel practices, and also an examination of how travel features in everyday talk, particular interest of mine, and how people negotiate these travel expectations that might come from these broader social trends, but might also potentially come from some of those pushing people around ideas that then seep into wider society. So how it might be good for older people to be traveling greater distances in various respects. So this is what we did in the actual studies. So we did quite a lot of interviews, as you can see. So 2 months apart in both Birmingham and London, we did 60 interviews in both sites. We stratified to try and explore socioeconomic status, gender and living arrangements, and we had 3 different age groups. And I think it'd be interesting to, perhaps in the discussion, to think about the kind of performative nature of our categories that we deploy when we do and devise our research projects. So we kind of like try to tackle retirement and age at the same time, when in practice you might think that those things are quite separate. So by structuring our sample in that kind of way, we kind of ended up producing a particular picture about how retirement and age intersected that might not always hold true. So when do people retire? Well, not necessarily always between their 55 and 60. So the ways in which particular strategies for dividing up the social world might then feed into the narratives and the accounts we might produce as a consequence is interesting here, I think. Then we focus on the present travel, past travel expectation and influences. How have you come to organise your level travel in broader sense, and what is it for? So going back to those demand centre ideas, what is travel for? What is it giving you? What's it allowing you to do? Our particular focus, as I said, was on leisure travel. We were particularly interested in the end in looking at how travel further afield was understood by our participants. So there's lots of work on travel in the locality, as I've alluded to already. We were quite interested in seeing the extent to which some of those ideas were migrating and supporting an idea of it being potentially beneficial, valuable to travel greater distances. So one of the things that we did was, I mean, there are lots of different ways of slicing up data in projects of this kind, and we tried to explore an idea of how what we call the field of possibility, drawing on certain ideas from Shatsky, so the broader social context and inference structural arrangements that might allow certain forms of travel to be possible, thought of as possible for particular individuals at certain points in time. And this is a graphic that kind of alludes to the ways in which we tried to do that. And in one of the papers that we produced, we looked specifically at an idea of demanding distances. So how this field of possibility, the broader social context, the broader set of circumstances within which our cohorts were living their lives might demand them to travel further afield. So how, because other people might be doing it, they should follow suit, how it was possible, how things were changing in terms of making it doable in practice, so kind of particular physical arrangements that would allow it to be possible for older people to travel further afield, and also connecting that to, I guess, flipping the idea of demanding distances, how distances were demanding. So thinking about physical aging processes and the ways in which our respondents negotiated the fact that physically it might be quite challenging to travel further afield. Did they kind of bunch up their travel at certain points in time before they got too old, as many of them said they did? How did they negotiate the fact of physical decline in contrast to this broader field of possibility that might encourage them to keep traveling further afield as they moved into later life? So that was one of the ways of slicing up the data that we developed. I think there could have been lots of others, and maybe we can turn to some of those in discussion. But in terms of returning to the expectations idea that I said was perhaps one of the most interesting things in the project. So definitely in the conversations we had, there's lots of talk and interesting ideas there deployed to us in terms of travel as successful retirement aging. So maybe thinking about how, perhaps supported by issues and ideas to do with the active aging agenda, how traveling further afield was deemed to be the right thing to be doing, a way in which you demonstrated to other people that you were coping well, that you're being a successful, active, older person. Then justified as a right, potentially, as a requirement. So when we talked about how generations might or might not be amenable to potentially reducing their travel, people would often recoil from that and emphasize how they were entitled to do as much travel as they wanted to. So how, when you target particular demographic groups, how they respond to that is of interest and perhaps relevance to what we're talking about here today. Travel talk is capability display, how by talking a lot about your travel, talking both with your peers and perhaps with your family about the travel that you're doing, you're underlining to them that you're capable of being able to do that travel, that you're still able to do this stuff. How that kicks into the ways in which people felt they should be organising their travel was an interesting aspect of the study. And then the colonisation of travel talk by distance, so how it was more socially valuable to talk about going further afield, how that might bleed into what people would do. Then there are issues to do with the actuality, so flipping that last graphic perhaps.
Are you wrapping up, Russ?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going on a bit, aren't I? Yeah, I'll skip that. And I'll say place-based decarbonisation agendas. So one of the things I think would be interesting to think about is how do we kind of think about, define the groups we might focus in on? Do we define people by age, by generation, or in some of our work by field of possibility? One of the things we wanted to do in our study was to kind of compare how we might analyse our data if we were to look at it in terms of physical aging and look at it in terms of generational. And I think we would have got very different accounts of what was happening in our material if we adopted one rather than the other. I think it'd be interesting to think about different metaphors for how change happens in this area of work. So switches, transition, bursts, reversals, some cool stuff in our work, I think, about how people negotiated a notion of retirement, whether that led to a burst of activity or not. Caring at a distance, there's some interesting stuff that we didn't develop but could do related to the last talk that links to how people might care for their family members by organising quality time when they're away from home. So care doesn't always happen in their locality, could feasibly be happening further afield. And maybe I'll stop there, but there's some other ideas that I think could be useful to explore perhaps.
Thanks a lot, Russ. Yeah, really interesting, and some really interesting sort of synergies with some of the themes that Claire was talking about. So thanks very much for that. I'm going to move us on quite swiftly so that we get a chance to hear from Leslie and also have 10 minutes at the end for discussion. So Leslie, I invite you to share your slides next.
Thank you. This stuff, yes. Oh, whoops. Sorry, I'm just gonna. Sorry, I should have started my show, shouldn't I, before I did that? Just 1 second. There we go. Right, is that it now? Can everyone see that all right?
That's great, Leslie. Yeah, great.
Great. So hi everyone, and thank you, Nicola, for inviting me to this really interesting panel. So I am going to concentrate today on the concept of generation in seeking to understand mobility cultures. I'm going to just put forward a couple of suggestions based on a study that is just coming to an end, looking at mobility cultures in 3 different cities in Europe. So I'm going to suggest some possible implications for decarbonisation. So I'm going to talk about engaging with time primarily here as well as place, and in particular a long view of time. This idea of the long view comes from MacLeod, who argues that we need to resist the privileging of particular times over others, and we can do so by taking a historical approach. So I'm just trying, there we go. So generation, I would argue, as opposed to life course, allows us to think about the kind of non-linearity of time and its relationality. And also we can look at the cultural aspects of the longer view of mobilities. So for me, generations create, reshape and soak up cultures of mobilities at particular moments in time, but with reference to their past and to their future. And these are evoked through sensory experiences in place. However, generations might also share temporal cultures regardless of place. So I've worked in generation through a number of research projects, including the Disruption Project that Greg and Noel here were involved with. And also I'm looking at generation and particularly the relationship between generation and gender in a current project that I'm doing on gender-based violence, the immobilities of gender-based violence in the COVID-19 pandemic, which you might think has little to do with thinking about decarbonisation and planning strategies for decarbonisation, but I'm going to suggest why that's relevant towards the end. But today I'm going to draw on this project, which was called, a very long name, Sensory Transformations and Transgenerational Environmental Relationships in Europe, 1950 to 2020, or SENSOTRA for short, which is a European Research Council advanced grant project, which was held at by a colleague, Helmi Jarveloma at the University of Eastern Finland. And we're using in this project the methodological approach of sensobiographies, which we are gathering through transgenerational walks. So we've already done it. So as part of the project, we organised a series of walks in Brighton, Ljubljana in Slovenia and Turku in Finland, which were people of different generations walking together and being in dialogue, very importantly. And I looked particularly at the aspects of this project. This was about sensory engagements with place over that time period, particularly in relation to how they are mediated through technologies, but my particular interest in the project was on mobility cultures. So I'd just like to kind of home in on the concept of generation and generational mobilities, and then I'm going to talk about generationed mobilities. So the concept of generation in contrast to the life course, well, the life course is generally understood as being a kind of predetermined linear path where individuals travel this kind of linear path. And linearity, I think, could be problematic in terms of age. For example, it can be used in relation to the universality of childhood and a developmental approach to childhood, but also it can be used in relation to this kind of linear decline through older age, this discourse around kind of the decline. Of course, there are projects like Kiron's who talked earlier, which are take a more critical approach to the life course with an emphasis on the interdependencies. But I would argue that generation allows us to take a more relational approach to time and that longer view of time, so that we can think about time about being in the past, in the present and the future, being kind of co-present in our current experience. So each is dependent on the other in relation to mobilities. It also allows us to bring in the historical aspects of mobilities and bring those into dialogue with mobilities in the present. For example, studies have looked back on transport policies and politics over the previous 100 years to make sense of and critique current policies. So this longer view, which I think is part of a generational approach, allows us to do that. It allows us to make sense of particular narratives in the historical and cultural settings. So rather than having this kind of linear timeline, we can look back and forward in a kind of disordered meanings and rememberings and understandings that determine current mobility practices. And I think it's through understanding these that we can begin to plan for changes that will reduce, continue to plan for changes that will reduce carbon emissions. Moss uses the term chains of memory to understand the relationships between past, present and future. the ways in which generations pass memories from one to the other according to particular cultural practices. The term generation encompasses this non-linearity of time and the relationality of memory and experience. So we have mobility identities, meanings and practices being ascribed and located to particular generations. They're passed through generations, and mobility practices are produced by intergenerational relations. So we can show, as Kiron talked about a bit earlier, this capacity to change. So for example, Pooley, various bits of work that he's carried out, but earlier work that looked at a historical approach where he showed that there was more continuity than change if we look back historically, and later work showing that the capacity to change. He looked at mobile subjects in the 19th century, for example, and the way in which they were prepared for disruption as it was very much part of everyday life, comparing that to present day. But kind of overall, the key point here is that generational mobilities are relational. So then we come on to the concept of generationed mobilities, and I think this is used in relation to politics and the politics of age. We can go back to Mannheim's conceptualizations of generations. He was one of the key theorists of generation and argued that transformation is possible as generational consciousness is formed from shared values that result from shared experiences, and internal antagonism is created through intersecting identities. There's been much debate around this concept of generation, and particularly in critiquing Mannheim's reading as being too static. But various scholars, including Leonard, who looked at the kind of sociology of generation, have mobilized this concept so that it can be considered more fluid and relational, but kind of keeping hold of this idea, which I think comes from Mannheim, which is about using generation as a structuring concept alongside gender, class, disability, ethnicity, sexuality, so that we can have relations being generationed, like they can be gendered and classed. So Leonard argues that generation can be both, this important point as well, can be both a temporary period for a particular cohort and a more permanent cultural position. So you can use generation in different ways, and indeed I've used it in different ways. I've used it in researching families and looking at kind of generation as cohort within families and the different relations that and mobility practices that families create between different generations. And then you can use it in this more kind of fluid way, which is what we're doing in this current project, which is looking at sensory transformations. The key point here, I think, in relation to generation mobilities is that power permeates generations. And we can use it to challenge some of those very crude assumptions about competencies according to age. For example, the understanding that particular technologies and the way that they become aligned to particular generations. So, for example, that this idea that younger people are much better at using, communication technologies. We can understand that from a generational perspective if we think about the way in which technologies become aligned to particular, in relation to a particular collective experience rather than a particular age. So using then generation alongside place enables us to investigate sensory engagements with urban space at particular moments or snapshots that offer opportunities to look across both time and place, which is something that we were doing in this project, which is about sensory mobilities. So we come to this idea of sensory mobilities, which was another key concept on this project, and in particular using Sarah's idea of the sensory being beyond the senses, so that we have this kind of, it's more about the feeling of particular spaces. So we have these embodied experiences of spaces which are dependent on the past, present and future mobilities. They're generationally defined with an understanding of the generationed body as differentiated. So Sarah argues for an understanding of sensory beyond the senses in which the senses are mingled and indistinguishable, about a felt experience. And Young, Nicola and Aldridge use this notion of sensory strategies or ways to negotiate hostile urban environments that are not permanent or static, but constantly adapted and interpreted by the user. For example, they talk about the use of the car radio to mask the sound of the car engine. So we can use that, I think, in seeking to decarbonise. We can think about how we sense carbon in different ways, and how we how are those sensory experiences that we have in kind of carbon-rich environments, how that we can understand those in order to change them. So to just a few little snapshots from the data that we collected, which was across these two sites of Brighton in the UK, Turku in Finland, and Ljubljana in Slovenia. And I think these show both mobility practices that become are part of generational collective experiences, and also thinking about how they differ across different spaces. And so I first of all looked for evidence for this kind of mingled senses, and for this looking across the three cities, this shared experience of the kind of sensory aspects of carbon emitting transport. So we have these experiences of these kind of rich sensory experience of smelling car exhaust fumes, those ideas of smells, and also the sound of particularly cars, and the way that transport has changed over the years, because of course people were looking back in time as well as forward in time to think about their present experience, but how those sensory and those mingled sensory experience, so the felt, the way that the different forms of transport were felt in the present, were very important to the way in which those generational understandings and generational practices were established.
Just got 2 minutes left, Leslie.
Yeah, that's fine. And so just some other examples, I'm not going to read all of these, but the feelings of decarbonisation. So there was very much a very different kind of sensory experience around walking and cycling, a much more positive experience, as you might expect, but much more felt. I think the way in which people describe their sensory experience were very different in walking, cycling, to cars, to being in the car, or actually being on a bus. And another kind of key point is about the sensory placedness of some experience. So this is an example. Again, I'm not going to read it, but I'll just explain what it is very briefly, from one of our participants in Ljubljana, and they were looking back on, they were walking past a railway station and thinking about using the trains, and reflecting on their mother's experience, who was their mother who was deported to Serbia, how they'd experienced being transported rather than being mobile in a very different way. So there was very much a placeness in, as well as this shared generational experience. So these are some of my just suggestions for taking this generational and generationed approach, so that generational and generationed mobilities can illuminate mobility cultures and practices which are needed for decarbonisation. That generation can be thought of as both relational and political. The data here was transgenerational, so even though it might not look like it was particularly talking about different generations, it was produced through transgenerational dialogue. And that we need to understand the way the city is sensed, and a generational understanding, collective experiences of that very much endure. And then just thinking about my recent work on immobilities of gender-based violence, the way in which the experiences as we move through generations become cumulative, and that really impacts on the way that we experience place in the present day. Thank you.